Hi, everyone. Welcome, students. As folks are getting settled in the Zoom space, I just want to thank everyone for being here with us today. Thank you so much to our alumni speakers for taking some time to share more about your careers, and of course to Steph, our student moderator, for leading the discussion. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Cassie Petoskey, and I use she or they pronouns. I'm the director of the Waldron Student Alumni Connections Program, where our goal really is to help you all explore career options through connecting with alumni. And I hear some background noise as folks are coming in. If we can mute ourselves, that's great. Perfect. So I am so excited to hear from our great alumni speakers later in just a few minutes here. But before we get started, I just want to share a few housekeeping items. For folks that are coming in, we do encourage you to turn your videos on, of course, so we can see a little bit more about who we're speaking with today. And, you know, keep your mics muted until we call on you at the end if you have student questions. And I also encourage students to add your class years and your pronouns to your names. It's just fun to get to know a little bit more about who we're speaking with today. And I'm going to pass it off to Steph here to kind of take us through a little bit more about the session and how it's going to run today. And thanks everyone for being here. So Steph, I would love for you to take it away.
Yeah, absolutely. As Cassie mentioned, thank you all again for being here for this great alumni program. My name is Steph, and I will be moderating the conversation today. And we have a great lineup of alumni speakers to share their insights with the group today. So once we hear from them for about 40 or so minutes, we will take questions from the audience. So if you want to turn on your mic and ask your question, please submit the question via the public chat tab, and then we will call on you. Or if you'd like us to read the question to our panelists, I'm happy to read it. You can send me or Cassie a private chat. But without further ado, let's get started with some introductions. Nina, would you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, happy to. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining today. My name is Nina Horowitz. I graduated from Northwestern in 1996. I studied French language and literature and international studies, and I am currently a Foreign Service Officer with the Department of State. I am serving right now in Tallinn, Estonia at the U.S. Embassy here as the Econ Officer. And previous tours in the Foreign Service include U.S. mission to the United Nations, the State Department's Environmental Bureau, 2 tours in Mexico and 1 in India. And prior to the service, joining the Foreign Service, I worked elsewhere in government and did a few other things, but I'm going to leave it there for now because I think we'll get to more details later. That's it. Great to see everyone.
Yeah, fantastic. Joe, would you mind sharing a little bit about your background?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Very nice to be part of this panel. I actually share a lot in common with Nina. I was also class of 96 and am currently working in DC, teaching at Georgetown on a teaching fellowship at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. Prior to that, I worked in DC at the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. So I was working as an Iraq analyst, and I served twice in Turkey working on consular issues, and then Iran for 3 years. And then my very first tour was in Tunis, Tunisia. At Northwestern, I majored first in mathematics, and then I switched over and majored in philosophy with a minor in German. And yeah, spent a good 16, 17 years trying to figure out what career I wanted to pursue before I joined the State Department in 2013. Thank you.
That is so awesome. Kari, would you mind sharing a little bit about your background?
Hi, everyone. I'm the outlier, I think, in this group. I graduated in '85 from Northwestern with political science and international relations. I later got an MBA, but that's not really relevant to my career because I started right after I graduated at the CIA, where I worked for 33 years. I served all over the world. I served in Turkey, Iraq twice, India. I like a lot of the places you've mentioned, I served there. And then I retired maybe 3-4 years ago, and I started working as an advisor and consultant, and sometimes consulting producer for TV shows that deal with espionage or intrigue or international relations. So currently I've worked on Homeland, The Diplomat. I'm currently working on The Morning Show and still on The Diplomat. There's more seasons coming. So I like to say that I felt like I really had a fun career, and I decided that if I was going to do anything in my retirement, it had to be fun as well. And so I'm finding the TV work, the imagination stuff, really fun.
That's incredible. What an awesome pivot. And lastly, Ramata, would you mind sharing a little bit about your background?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. Like my other colleagues here, I also am a Foreign Service officer with the Department of State. I graduated from Northwestern in 2009, and I studied political science and international studies and business institutions. I joined the Foreign Service in 2017. And I'm currently serving in DC as a press advisor in the Bureau for Near Eastern Affairs, or the Middle East Bureau. And I cover the Arabian Peninsula. So this is my third tour. So I did 2 tours prior, including a consular officer in Johannesburg at the consulate there, as well as the spokesperson for the consulate in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. That was my first tour. Prior to joining the Foreign Service, I worked as a USAID contractor here in DC, backstopping development projects. And then I decided I wanted to do more of the policy aspects of international affairs. And so I went to Johns Hopkins SAIS, and then later joined the Foreign Service. Happy to get into more details, but that's a little intro for you. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. So to kick off our panel today, perhaps Ramata, maybe you could ask this first or answer this first question, but can you share with us some of the impactful classes or experiences for you in undergrad that led you to pursue your career path in the Foreign Service?
Sure. I think one of the most impactful experiences was doing study abroad. So I knew that I wanted to study abroad in undergrad. And so my junior year, I did some research and did study abroad in Paris. So I did a European Union studies program. Sorry if there's background noise. It's loud in my neighborhood. I did a study abroad in Paris. It was a European Union studies program. So that was fall of 2007. And I liked it so much that I ended up staying for another semester. So it wasn't the same program. It was a slightly different program, but I worked with the study abroad office to continue to study abroad in Paris and make sure that the classes were able to be transferred. So that was an impactful experience just because, while I had traveled abroad before, just living abroad, obviously you're immersed in another culture. I was able to speak French there. I had a nice cohort of people. It just really opened my eyes to just being abroad, living abroad. And so I knew that I definitely wanted to work abroad after I graduated. So another impactful experience, I would say, I took an international ethics course. I think it was Michael Lorio. I just remember that class was impactful in the sense that we just learned about sometimes we don't make the right decisions as the US. And it was the first time I had had a course where we sort of questioned some of the things that we do. It was a class, it was philosophical. It was about different classes of realism. And, we talked about Vietnam War and maybe some of the decisions we might not some of the best decisions we might have made. I just found it impactful because it just challenged our beliefs about international affairs. And yeah, I found it to be very impactful. I'll leave it there. So study abroad and an international ethics course. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And Kari, could you maybe share how some impactful undergrad classes or experiences led you to the CIA?
It was honestly, it was kind of an accident that I ended up there. But I did take, I did find the whole, and I think the reason that they wanted me to join actually was that I had taken an undergraduate sort of summer abroad in Canada, but I was doing research for one of my professors. He was looking at the Liberal Party of Quebec. At that time, it was quite a strong separatist movement. So I went up to Canada speaking French. I'd taken French, I'd taken Russian, I'd taken some languages, and then I went there, I did some research for his work there, which turned out to be, sort of relevant to the kind of work I ended up doing. So they came to campus and found me. I don't really know necessarily how. I went to the placement center and at that time, there was no online stuff. So at that time you just had things you could sign up for, and they all sounded really super boring to me. But the one thing that sounded sort of interesting and a good experience was to interview with the CIA. I figured, if I'm looking for interview experience, that sounds like a pretty good one. So at least it'll be a good story to tell. So I went, and it just kept sounding super interesting. And I was looking at that point to go to law school, but I wasn't so keen on being like a tax attorney or something. It sounded, I wanted something really fun and interesting still. I was 22 years old. And so this just kept sounding interesting, and I kept going back for their interviews, and they, hired me.
That's awesome. What a great story. I love that it was kind of spontaneous. Joe, would you mind sharing, since folks have, all different academic backgrounds, can you talk about your path to the Foreign Service and International Affairs, I guess more generally, and maybe tack on some advice for how students can break into these spaces today?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. As I mentioned at the top, it took me quite a while to find my path towards the State Department. I suffered from what I call professional ADD, in the sense that I tried a few things. I moved abroad after my undergraduate degree to Germany. I'd majored in philosophy, so I didn't have the greatest job prospects right off the bat. But I'd minored in German, so I moved to Germany. And that kind of opened the pathway towards an international affairs career. And then my mother's Turkish, so I grew up spending a lot of time in Turkey as a child. And so I had Turkish, and I started studying Arabic while I was in Germany. This is in the late 90s still. So as soon as 9/11 happened, then I kind of thought, okay, I have kind of a career path here. I could do something that I find interesting that I think will be relevant for some time, for at least my lifetime. And that turned me on to pursuing a PhD, which I did at the University of Chicago in Middle Eastern Studies. But pretty early on, I was aware that I didn't want to stay in academia. I didn't want to continue teaching. So that's when I started looking around. And I took a workshop at the University of Chicago called Beyond the Ivory Tower. And I'm sure Northwestern offers similar kind of career advice workshops, which I found extremely helpful. And that pointed me in the direction of Department of State. So I threw my hat in the ring a few years before I finished my PhD. It is a long and winding process. But once the timing kind of worked out for me. So I finished my PhD and joined right out of that degree in 2013 at State. And I think the best thing about State for me has been the fact that we do change jobs and our setting and our colleagues every 2 to 3 years. So that kind of addressed the professional ADD issues I had, all within a secure, steady job environment, right? So I have a career path, but I get to dibble and dabble in different things throughout my career, which I love.
That's great. And Nina, could you maybe also touch on your path to the Foreign Service and International Affairs, and again, advice for how students who maybe want to follow in your footsteps might be able to?
Sure, I'm happy to talk about that. I think I'll start off with like a kind of a funny anecdote, at least funny to me, which is that when I was in my last year at Northwestern, as I mentioned, I was in international studies. At the time, it was like a they called it a certificate program. So it was sort of like a little bit more than a minor, but a less than a major. Not sure how it stands now, but in any case, we were in one of the IR classes, and the Foreign Service recruiters came to our class. And I mean, this was probably a pretty common thing for them to do back then, to come to various universities and go to the IR programs thinking like, these are the candidates that we want to target, you know, for the Foreign Service. And I remember very clearly at that time, I was like, well, I do want to do international something after I graduate. It sounds interesting, but I don't want to join the Foreign Service. I was thinking, and the reason why was I said, I don't want to have somebody else tell me where to go and where to move and where to be like every 2 or 3 years. So I was just like, nope. And I just kind of like rejected the idea at that time. Again, you know, at the 21 years of age, maybe potentially not thinking I knew everything, you know, thinking I know everything, obviously didn't know it all yet. But in any case, I did do a few other things, many other things actually, before I joined the Foreign Service. So as I said, I graduated in 96. I didn't join the Foreign Service until 2012. Like my friend Joe here, I also attended the University of Chicago. I did not get a PhD. I got a master's in public policy at the Harris School of Public Policy Studies. And it was a really excellent experience. Between graduating and going to the University of Chicago, I lived in Japan for 1 year, taught English there. That was the first thing I did after graduating. So when you decide to reject the Foreign Service, then you don't know what to do, then why not move to Japan and teach English? That was sort of the reasoning behind that. And it was a really fun year. And I'll also just say, as Ramata said, she studied abroad. I also studied abroad in Paris when I was at Northwestern. So that was another kind of step in the path. I mean, I knew I wanted to do something international, but getting there was a really long and winding road for me. So Japan, and then I came back and I worked in Chicago at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. I worked for a small software company, so casting about a little bit. But once and I think that 9/11 also had an impact on me as well, because I knew I wanted to work internationally. I think at that point I knew I wanted to work for the federal government and sort of contribute in that way, right? So I went to the University of Chicago. I got the public policy degree. And then after that, I joined the federal government, though not in the Foreign Service. I joined the Government Accountability Office, which is the policy and research evaluation arm of the US Congress. So I worked there for 8 years. And during that time, I also did a detail to the Senate. So I had kind of all of these experiences adding up, but there was still kind of something that I felt like I wanted to get to and I wasn't doing. And again, similar to what one of the other panelists said, I think it was Ramata, I wanted to get in on the front end of the policy process. What I was really interested in was like influencing, developing, creating, thinking about the policy on the front end in the development sort of stage, right? And so that's when I kind of just switched gears and I decided to start getting into the Foreign Service. Well, it was a little bit more accidental than that, but anyway, it took a little while, but I did make it. And I'll say, I think you asked as well, like what advice we would have for the students who are thinking about this. So, I mean, I guess I would say, don't be afraid to try, different things, right? It's okay to spend a little bit of time figuring out what it is you really want to go for. And I will also say, don't listen to the gatekeepers, because I think I did too, and that might have accounted for the reason why I took a long time getting to the Foreign Service. I really wanted to do international stuff. Like I knew it from a young age, but there were a lot of gatekeepers out there who would say things like, well, it's really competitive to get into XYZ and, international anything. And I think I unfortunately listened to them maybe a little bit too strongly. So I guess one piece of advice I would give is don't listen to the gatekeepers. I mean, if you are interested in something, go for it. Reach out to people, reach out on LinkedIn. I mean, now there's so many more ways to communicate with people and reach out and, attending this panel, and you have a lot of resources at Northwestern now also to support you. So you know, that would be just sort of a little tip.
Yeah, I really appreciate that tip about giving yourself a chance. I think that's so important, especially when we're in such a competitive environment. That could be something that's difficult to remember. Um, Joe, do you think you could give us a quick overview of the State Department and your job function, just more generally, so we understand more what it's like to be a Foreign Service officer?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I'm still trying to get over the fact that Nina and I share even more in common than I thought. I also did a master's degree at the Harris School. So you and I definitely need to get in touch after this and talk. Yeah, overview of the State Department. It's a hard question to answer because there are so many facets to it. One thing I often say to students who are thinking about this career is that it really is a limitless career in the sense that everyone pursues a different pathway. Generally speaking, as Foreign Service officers, we choose one of 5 career paths while we're applying. They're called cones. There's political, economic, public affairs, management, and consular. I happen to choose the political track, and so most of my career has been spent abroad working on political issues, writing cables. That said, there's a whole side of the State Department that is the civil service side, where people spend most of their career living abroad or living in DC, working at headquarters. And so if you're like Nina at a younger age and don't really want to move every 2 or 3 years, there's a whole half of the department where you can work here in DC. And then there's obviously jobs spread out around the states. So it's hard to answer kind of what a career looks like in the State Department, especially as an FSO, Foreign Service Officer, just because everyone has these kind of forks in the road every 2 to 3 years. And so your career can go in directions that you didn't anticipate when you came in, and it can kind of do a 180 pretty quickly. I've been fortunate. I've spent most of my career in the Middle East, which is my personal and professional interest. But I know people who have selected their assignments abroad based solely on the quality of surfing in the country, for example. It's good to have priorities. So my other piece of advice would be to have a sense of what you want to get out of this career, because you will have these forks in the road every 2 to 3 years. So it's good to know where you want to be and also kind of what you value in this career and what you want to get out of it. That'll help you make those decisions every few years. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. And Kari, could you maybe give more of like a day in the life of a CIA agent, maybe a little bit more of an overview of what it's like to be working for the CIA?
Sorry, I muted. So it's also one of those jobs where it's every 3 or so years you change. You learn a new language, you live in a different country, you have different sort of subjects that you are collecting information on. But it's but what it's basically boils down to is that the CIA is supposed to get the information that no one else can get, and inform our policymakers of the facts. It isn't about policy. We don't make policy. We don't advise on policy. We just give the facts. We have to go out and find them, get them, bring them in, which is, I found super interesting. You know, I love to know how stuff works. So going out and trying to figure out who the power players are, who knows what, are they telling you the truth? You know, not surprisingly, people lie. So you have to sort of figure out, you know, what's right, what's wrong, what's true, what's not, and do your best job of getting out there and, you know, and bringing back to your, you know, executive, you know, the president, so that they can make the best decisions. Sometimes they don't necessarily take your information. I mean, they can decide to use it or not. That's how it is. But it is fun. You have different incarnations. I mean, I've been several different people over the years, and you know, that's kind of fun. If you have a little bit of an actor in you, you know, it's a good way to scratch that itch. When I was at Northwestern, a lot of my friends were theater. You know, I'm sure all of yours are too. because there's so many. And so you got to kind of do a little bit of that, but you didn't, that wasn't your main job, but you got to sort of, reinvent yourself in a way, in a lot of ways. And you have a lot of responsibility as a junior officer. A lot, because you go out and your cover is the best when you're first out in the field. So at the end of my career, I was managing people more than I was doing, sexy spy stuff. So I had some fun in my junior career, and just some incredible stuff. Stuff so good I can't even tell you about it. So yeah, it was fun.
Ramata, do you think you could talk a little bit about how like changes in the last few years have impacted your experience, I guess both the foreign service like field overall and also your personal job, things like the pandemic, generative AI, new updates like that?
Sure. I can talk a little bit about the pandemic. So just like a little story, I was in Jeddah, March 2020. I was on my way home for R&R, which is our vacation. I was actually planning to go to all these other different places. And I remember the CG my boss at the time was like, you can't go anywhere. You're not gonna be able to get back in. And I was determined to have my leave. So I go home to DC March, I think it was like March 13th. And then like I was meant to be home for 2 weeks. 2 weeks flew by, and then Saudi Arabia closed their borders. And I couldn't go back to work. I couldn't go back to post. So essentially I finished the remainder of my tour. I had I guess 8 months left. I was ending August of that year. So I did the remaining 8 months in DC, like 7-8 hours behind. And so that was an adjustment. So I'm public diplomacy coned. Joe mentioned the cones. So as a public diplomacy officer, it's very public facing. I'm constantly sort of making contacts to try to host programming at the consulate, trying to engage with journalists and other media folks to, speak positively about the kind of work we were doing. And so you can imagine, like in a pandemic, you can't really do that face to face, right? So everything basically, as you know, pivoted to virtual online platforms. And so basically all of our programmings, we then had to be creative and move to virtual platforms, but part of it was also finding a way to get people to participate. So not only was it the beginning of the pandemic, but then a couple months later, it was Ramadan, which is also coming up again. So during Ramadan, in the Middle East, it's a time that it's hard to engage with people. In fact, they want to engage later in the evening, like sometimes like in the, after 10 o'clock, 12 o'clock, that's when, the society is lively and stuff. So we had to kind of make adjustments in a lot of our programming to make sure we could get people to participate. I remember we hosted like a sort of something similar to this, like a career panel, because a lot of the Saudis that I was in contact with said they don't have a lot of, sorry, my Apple Watch. They didn't have a lot of resources for career advice, or, student counselors was not really a thing there. So, they came to us to say, hey, can you put together some kind of a panel where we could hear from other, diplomats, young diplomats like yourself, or other Saudis that have found ways to pivot in their careers. And so, we were able to get ample participation just by using social media to, to obviously advertise. And and then another example, so I gave a Saudi example, living in Johannesburg, still the pandemic. So I moved to Johannesburg, December 2020. as a consular doing my consular tour. So in the Foreign Service, you have to do at least one tour as a consular officer, because that is the bread and butter of the Foreign Service. So I did it my second tour. And so, as you can imagine, there's no travel really. So there's not really a demand. There's no visas, so I get to post and it's like, we're not doing interviews because we're not issuing visas to people at this time. So again, then it was more of a pivot to American Citizen Services and how do we help all of the Americans here that need, passport renewals, or they need to get out of the country and be repatriated back home. So yeah, it was challenging. I had friends that joined the Foreign Service during the pandemic and couldn't even, everything was online. I couldn't even imagine, like, what a crazy time to be joining the Foreign Service. So yeah, that was my experience with the pandemic. I can't speak much to AI. I just know that a lot of people now so we have to write evaluations, and I'm pretty sure people are using like ChatGPT to write their EERs or something, which I don't think I wouldn't recommend that, but I'll stop there.
That's so funny. Yeah, I get the sense that that's a pretty common application of ChatGPT nowadays. Nina, could you perhaps talk about how changes in the last few years, like the pandemic, or maybe you could touch on AI, impacted your experience in the Foreign Service?
Sure. I mean, with AI, I'll say, I'll take that one first. So I am an econ coned officer. So we talked about the cones a little bit. Ramata Sow's PD and Joe is political. I am econ. So in econ, we cover economic affairs sort of writ large, but that can include anything from sort of macroeconomic conditions in the country where we are. It can be sort of sanctions type of policies, trade, investment, energy, environment, science, technology, health, all of these things, and environmental. All of that comes in to the econ cone. So in an econ sort of cone career, you can cover any one of those topics, and I have covered now almost all of them in the time that I've been in the Foreign Service. And AI is actually one of the topics that usually does sort of fall under the econ cone, because it comes under sort of technology, and of course it's an emerging technology, very emerging very, very quickly. So I would say operationally for the State Department, the State Department is actually has just put forth a kind of AI policy, like how can we use AI in the State Department? So Ramana mentioned our performance reviews. So that may be one application, but they are actually looking at other ways to use AI within the State Department. A lot of it has to do with sort of management of operations, just sort of internal programs and that kind of stuff to make things kind of go faster. A lot of processes and technology State Department is from about, I mean, like I said, I graduated Northwestern 1996. It's from about that time. So, the State Department is due to update a lot of things. So internally operational with the State Department, like they're using and thinking about how to use AI. From a policy standpoint, State Department is also very involved with AI policy. As State Department Foreign Service officers, we are, when we're overseas, charged with reporting on what's going on where we are. So I am in Estonia, as I mentioned. Estonia is in the EU. So the EU has a lot going on with AI, a lot of new legislation. The State Department and the US writ large kind of are not super big fans of what the EU AI view perspective is. So there's been a lot of a lot of activity on that front, on the policy front for AI. I will say for Estonia, just a note, I mean, they're pretty technologically astute here. So I think they're pretty open to AI, and they're open to the kind of US view on it as well. In terms of the pandemic, yeah, I mean, I think Ramana probably hit all the high points. We had to shift very quickly. I was in Mexico City at the time that the pandemic hit, working at the embassy there. And I remember going into the embassy one day in mid-March, and we sat down, we had a meeting with the ambassador, And the ambassador said, okay, tomorrow we're going to start teleworking. Like, this pandemic is real. It's serious. Telework starts tomorrow. And then the second in command of the embassy came in and he said, okay, so everybody spend the rest of today figuring out how you're going to telework tomorrow, because tomorrow it starts and you got to stay home. And that was it. And it was actually quite rocky at the beginning, because as I mentioned, State Department technology, I mean, we all had laptops at home, but a lot of the applications and everything were really hard to use from home, and nobody was really used to it. And it was really tough. So I will say, from that time to now, the State Department actually, it got a lot better in terms of the technology and using all of these communication platforms and that kind of thing, because of the pandemic. And yeah, so I think that's how that changed for me at that time. And I do think it will have a lasting impact on the way the State Department operates, just because we've sort of they had to like make it work really fast. And then some of those things are continuing, so.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Joe, what was your experience like? Is there anything you'd like to add?
Quite similar. I was in Istanbul, Turkey at the time. It, in many ways, hindered what I could do in my role. I was working as the Iran watcher, which is kind of a unique job in the State Department because we don't have diplomatic relations with Iran. So we have 8 officers that we send, 4 in the region, in the Middle East region, and 4 in Europe, that try to cover Iran from abroad, from outside of Iran. And so Turkey is one of the few countries Iranians can travel to without a visa. So it is often the first place Iranians travel to when they come abroad, whether they're dissidents or refugees or students or just tourists. So my job really was dependent on getting out and meeting Iranians as much as I could. At first, I thought the pandemic's a big hindrance for that, because there were restrictions on, where we could go. People were less willing to meet. But as the pandemic wore on, it in a way turned out to be a blessing, because I wasn't expected to spend as much time in the consulate in Istanbul. And so I, perhaps taking some liberties with protocol, went out and met Iranians as often as I could, in the streets of Istanbul, at cafes, at community centers where I knew Iranians traveled. A lot of times, churches or even synagogues were a good place, because religious minorities were fleeing Iran. And so it became the most fascinating tour that I've had in the State Department out of the 5 or 6 that I've done. But it did require being flexible and a bit kind of creative with how I was going to do my job, given the circumstances of the pandemic. And I don't have much to say about AI. As Nina mentioned, the State Department's pretty slow to adapt emerging technologies. I do tell my students, though, that at Georgetown, that first of all, it's Georgetown policy that you can't use AI to write your papers, but also it's learning with that crutch is really disabling, in the sense that when you get to the State Department, it's a bit about how you write, but most of it is about how you interact and how you answer questions that you're asked in person. If you're giving a briefing, you can't rely on AI to do the briefing for you. So the timing in college and grad school really is about learning the skills and the kind of intellectual frameworks that you need. And I think AI probably doesn't really help you do that at this age. Thank you.
Some good advice there on AI. Kari, could you talk about how the pandemic impacted your life, and maybe if you know anything about the CIA adopting AI or anything like that? That'd be super interesting to hear about.
Well, I can tell you that I retired by the time the pandemic hit. I was living in Austria, so but I was doing TV stuff. So I was working on Berlin Station, I think, and maybe Homeland then. So I was able to do that. I participated in writers' room remotely. They all switched at that time. So it was fairly seamless. I mean, there's something better, of course, about being in a room with creative people and bouncing ideas and coming up with, storylines and characters and things. But Zoom did a pretty good job. I mean, it wasn't so bad. So so for me personally, it limited to some extent my ability to travel. But yeah, that's fine. I worked around it. I did what everybody else did. In terms of AI and the agency, of course, that is a big, I'm not there now. I don't know, but I can tell you from being there for so long that it's going to be a fantastic tool for assimilating and going through large quantities of data. And since, part of what we do is compile information that's out there and synthesize it and look for example, little pieces like before 9/11, all the criticism came because little pieces of information were not put together properly. I think AI will be a great tool in helping to grab disparate bits of information and sort through them faster. So I see it as as a tool to be used for the good.
That's great. Okay, so I'm thinking I'll ask one more quick question that all of you can hopefully touch on, and then we can open it up to student questions. So maybe we can start off with Nina. What do you wish you could tell yourself when you were in all of our shoes as students?
Well, maybe pay closer attention to the Foreign Service recruiters who are coming through. No, but I think I would give the advice to say, really listen to yourself, pay close attention. What it is, sometimes your actions can speak louder than words. So sort of pay close attention to what it is you are attracted to, what it is you want to do, what kind of books, what kind of, what are you studying? What kind of people do you like to talk to? What kind of podcasts do you listen to? This all sort of reveals something about yourself and what you want to do, what direction you want to go in. So I would say pay attention to those things and really listen to yourself. And actually, like how you put it before, give yourself a chance. And then once you sort of settle on those things, or you can identify those things, find some people to talk to about it. I think one of the best things I did in grad school was I found a lot of people to informationally interview. So I would just, get in touch with people and say, hey, I'm interested in the job that you're doing. Do you have a few minutes to talk to me about it? And, that was a kind of a more in-person thing that I did back then, but now it's so easy to communicate online and video calls and that kind of thing. So, I would say just go for it and reach out to people. And, if somebody doesn't have time to talk, don't worry about it. Just move on to the next one. So that would be my advice.
Yeah, thank you so much. Ramata, what would be your advice to anyone in our shoes right now?
I echo Nina's sentiments too. And I'd also say to just be flexible. I think sometimes when we go in and we think we know exactly what we want to do, but just give yourself a chance to explore other options. I mean, like I came into Northwestern, even though I was interested in international affairs, I didn't know what kind of job that would be. So I came in pre-med in the fall of 2009, and I quickly was weeded out, like did horribly in Gen Chem and AP Calc or not AP Calc, because I knew that wasn't what I was interested in. But what's so awesome about Northwestern is that there's so many great schools and majors that you can choose from. Someone mentioned theater. I mean, they have the engineering school, they have the communication school. I mean, what better place than Northwestern for me to want to make a change, like a kind of a big change or be undecided, because there's so many great options. So yeah, be flexible. I think, also be humble. And I say that because I graduated in 2009 and the market was horrible. And literally I applied to a lot of things. I might not have been as good at networking. So definitely hone in on your networking skills. And so, I mean, I was when I graduated, I didn't have a job. And so, I was open to applying to maybe things that I wouldn't necessarily have been interested in, but just, I needed a job. I needed to pay back my loans. But also it's just, it's like kind of an exercise in humility. So being flexible, being open-minded, maybe you might have to do an internship that's not paid. Like I had to do that. Yeah, but I have so many thoughts. And I look forward to answering questions, just if it's helpful, given, this is not too far away from, for me. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Kari, what advice would you give to us when you were our age?
Working, like when you graduate from college, you're going to work for a lot of years. So pick something that you want to do. I mean, like, be passionate about it. Like, you should be happy. I mean, you're not going to be happy to go to work every single day. It's work, right? They call it work. But if you can find something that you feel that makes you excited to get up in the morning and go do it, then you have won. You are winning at life if you can do that. So, and I think part of that is being like a curious human being, like, the world is a huge place. You're already all interested in the rest of the world, or you wouldn't be sitting in this group right now. If tap into that, don't think you know too much to be curious about stuff. Ask questions, go out there and try new stuff. Always be challenging your sort of outlook on the world. I mean, I think these careers give you a really special opportunity to go out and immerse yourself in another culture, and which makes you sort of reflect on things that you take as givens, which aren't actually givens. So I would say, this is a wonderful time in your life. You have every option available to you. So you don't limit yourself. Go out there, be curious, try stuff, and pick something that you dig,
That is great advice. You're so right. We have a whole career ahead of us. So definitely want to make sure it's something that we enjoy at least a little bit. Joe, last but most certainly not least, what would you add on?
I would echo everything people have said. The one thing I would add to it, and this is drawn from personal experience, is that don't worry if at 22, at 25, even at 35, if you haven't found your calling quite yet. I find that the careers I tried but didn't pursue long term are some of the most rewarding experiences I've had. With the State Department, as I mentioned earlier, because your job changes so much, you come to a lot of points where you wonder, should I keep doing this? Is this rewarding? Am I getting out of this career what I was hoping to get out of it? Knowing that I tried things like management consulting and didn't like it, or I tried a couple of years as a journalist freelancing in the Middle East and it wasn't for me. I've gained skills from those experiences, but I feel much more secure in my career now, knowing that I've tried other things that didn't quite work, things that I didn't feel were my life's calling. It allows me to kind of weather some of the challenges I face in this career rather than immediately thinking, oh, this isn't for me. I should be doing something else. But then again, the skills you pick up doing things like management consulting or journalism readily transfer into the State Department. And that's one thing that I like about not just state, but I think foreign affairs in general, is it's a broad set of skills that you need to bring to the table. And as long as you're still developing your skills, don't worry about the fact that you don't know what you're going to do for the next 40 years by the time you're 25. Just keep developing the skills and kind of getting a sense of who you are and what makes you click. And then at some point, maybe by the time you're 39, you'll figure out what it is you want to do when you become an adult.
That's great advice. Awesome. Okay, well, now opening it up to student questions. Our first question is, what does work-life balance look like for you? I'll let any of you take it, but do you have partners, families? I know, especially when you're moving around so much, that can look a little different.
So I can go.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah,
Thank you, Kari.
I have 2 kids and a husband who worked for the World Bank. So we had 2 international careers that were not necessarily in line all the time, and then raising 2 kids in all countries all over the world, with my crazy job. So, so it looked a little bit like a village. I mean, it kind of depended on the place. When I was assigned in a war zone, my kids obviously couldn't come, neither could my husband. So, and that happened more than once. So I went, and I had to rely on, help at home to help with my kids. I mean, I think, and there are people who, and I started out with my career and I was single and it was really fun and it was much easier that way, but you still had to move and you're far away from your family. So, um, I think my best advice to people when they're like junior officers doing this is, especially to women, honestly, is, don't let people tell you what you should be doing. You define what normal is. You define what family looks like to you, and don't let other people's judgments bother you. Um, you know, my kids are very happy with the way that, I mean, it wasn't necessarily conventional, how they were raised, but they're interesting people now. So, and they're not in like deep therapy for their childhoods or anything. So I think that and in fact, my daughter went to Northwestern, so there you go. So yeah, I don't know if there ever is balance necessarily in work life. I kind of bristle at that. You do your best, and you define what normal is for you.
Yeah, thank you so much. In the interest of time, we can do another quick question. Someone asked, how do you navigate international travel as women specifically? So maybe Ramata or Nina.
Sure. So, I mean, so my first tour was in probably one of the most conservative countries. Luckily, as I was arriving, the country was starting to liberalize and open up a lot more. Women were able to drive, a few months before I arrived. And they started to really develop their tourism industry and became even more relaxed about some dress. Like I remember before I arrived, I was told you need to wear an abaya, which is basically kind of it's a robe that sort of, it's modest, to not really show off your figure. Was never told that I had to cover my hair. Sidebar, I'm Muslim, so it wasn't as shocking for me. But I guess what was beneficial was being a Westerner in that country. And once sort of they hear you talking, you'll find that, at least at the time, you'll find that they're less sort of like, why are you dressed kind of not modestly, like, oh, okay, you're different, you're a foreigner, but I would say, like, sorry, what was the original question? I'm talking about dress. What was it? Traveling in these?
Yeah, as women in just around the world.
Okay, so I guess I'm giving like an extreme example of living in the Middle East. But as far as like traveling as a woman, I guess maybe making sure I felt safe or something. I never felt any hiccups about traveling. Like I'm single. I'm unaccompanied. And so I've done a fair amount of travel within the Middle East, in Southeast Asia, in various parts of Africa. I think obviously you have to be aware of your surroundings and be smart. But I've never, I think just common sense goes a long way. I hope that answers the question. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's great. Okay, maybe one last question. What does entry-level work look like in international affairs? Like, what are the job titles and what is the work like? Yeah.
I can speak to that too. So like I mentioned, I graduated in 2009. I was applying to everything. My first, I guess, real job was I was an administrative assistant for a USAID contractor called ACDI VOCA. So basically, they have development projects in like developing countries around the world. And so an entry-level job is like an administrative assistant or a project assistant. It is a lot of administrative functions. It's a lot of, there was a lot of sort of like basic accounting, like note taking, but you're getting a lot of information. You're able to network with higher ups. You're hearing a lot of information. And so while it might seem like, I have a degree from Northwestern and I have like, I'm doing this like very basic, I have that attitude, I'll admit it. But you have to start somewhere. You have to, start at the bottom. And that's what I had to do. And so I was able to network, and then I got a project assistant job, and then I became a project coordinator. And then I realized, I'm more interested in policy. So I went to grad school, and then I applied for the Foreign Service. But all to say that, you have to kind of start somewhere and sort of humble yourself. So hope that's helpful. That was my entry-level job. And I did quite a few internships as well.
Yeah. Any other, Kari, Joe, Nina, would you like to add on? Yeah, thanks, Joe.
I would just be perhaps specific to the Foreign Service. As one of the other panelists mentioned, we all do a consular tour. And often you'll do one of your first two tours. You're required to do a consular tour for one of your first two tours. Ideally, the other tour would be in the cone you've selected. So you get a chance pretty early on to see what kind of work you'll be working on longer term. With the State Department, there's something about just being flexible, not just in your career, like the kind of work you're doing, but kind of in your lifestyle. And so that's part of the culture at the State Department. And so some of the most interesting experiences I had in my first tour, I was working as a human rights officer in Tunis, Tunisia. This is shortly after the Arab Spring, and still a lot of security questions, unstable governments. And so the most interesting things happened during those kind of unstable moments where people were kind of doing their job a bit ad hoc and on the fly. And so even though I was a bit older and perhaps took some offense to the idea that I was, a PhD at 39 and my boss was a 24-year-old who had just finished college a couple of years earlier, it didn't bother me that much just because I found the stuff that we were working on was interesting. And I understood that the State Department is a large bureaucracy. And so learning the ropes does take time. So I'd rather spend some time learning how the thing operates before I assume, mid-level or senior level responsibilities. And so as long as you find parts of the job rewarding and you can take something from each stage, then doing some of these entry-level positions did not bother me in any sense, in any kind of deeper sense.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Kari or Nina, do either of you have anything to add or maybe any closing remarks? Totally okay if not.
I guess I would just I like what Joe said about staying humble, and I think Ramata used the word as well, and staying curious, which I think Kari said earlier. All of that is really good advice, I think, in any path that you would take in international affairs. I think I'll come back also to the point that I made earlier, which is that you can chart your own course and find out and do as much as you can to learn about what that course might be. Don't be afraid to switch gears. I think Joe has said it, and I've said it too. We've done a few different things before getting to the Foreign Service, and that was good too, because we brought everything, I think, into the Foreign Service, and it gave us a sort of unique set of skills. I think when you're putting yourself out there, the one thing I would say is, when I have mentored a few students from Northwestern and also from my grad school who are specifically interested in taking the Foreign Service exam, and I have coached them through that. And I've had a few mentees who've gotten really caught up on kind of the test itself or what kind of experience, expertise that they need to get into the Foreign Service in particular. And I will say, you don't need any, actually. You don't need any specific topical experience to get into the Foreign Service. But you are bringing to the table sort of like your whole set of life experiences. Like who you are is really more important than what you know when it comes to getting into the Foreign Service, and how you present yourself is, you know, through the whole kind of phases of the different tests and everything is what is really critical. So anyway, happy to connect later if anyone has like those more specific questions about entrance into the Foreign Service. But I would say it's actually kind of general advice as well for job seekers. Think more about what it is you bring to who you are and what you're bringing to the table, kind of skills and experience wise, rather than specific expertise and topics at this stage. And good luck to everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nina. Well, that is the end of our time here together. So I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Thank you so much for logging on today. And please join me in thanking our alumni speakers for such great insights with the group today. I know you guys gave so much fantastic advice that I will be taking with me as I, embark on my career, which is very exciting. Keep an eye out for a follow-up email from Nick with the Waldron Connections program with the alumni information, and an email from Grubhub with your $20 credit if you were one of the first 50 students on the call. We try to buy our attendees lunch when we have in-person events, so this is our way of doing something similar with virtual events. But thank you all again, and we hope you have a great rest of your day. Go Cats!
Thanks all.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye. Go Cats.